And luckily for Africa at the time, they gained independence during a Cold War, and so they could receive foreign aid from either the West or the Soviet Union in exchange for being on their side in the Cold War. And while of course every African country had different economic policies, they were all kind of similar to this, but African socialism simply didn't work. First of all, the trade restrictions meant that African countries couldn't sell products to each other, meaning that it was hard to find customers to buy any products made in Africa. As a result, none of the industries could grow large enough to be able to compete with the industries of North America, Europe, or East Asia. And so nobody else wanted to buy African goods because they could get those same goods better and cheaper from other countries. Secondly, a single large government isn't able to adapt to changes in world markets as quickly as hundreds of smaller businesses, meaning that centrally planned economies will always be less efficient than economies which have a lot of different businesses competing with each other. Thirdly, Africans simply lacked the skills and education required to work in manufacturing jobs in the first place, meaning that they were far less efficient than their better educated counterparts in the rest of the world, so it would take decades before enough qualified professionals would join the job market. And so African countries select the people needed to make their countries thrive. The fourth reason why it didn't work is not so much about African socialism itself, but about the continent of Africa, because Africa's landscape is harsh, with some places experiencing droughts lasting years, such as the drought which lasted from 1968 to 73, causing large food shortages, while other parts have locusts and red-billed queller birds, which make agriculture nearly impossible. The fifth reason was disease: yellow fever, smallpox, sleeping sickness, and malaria, about a few of the diseases which plagued African development. And while smallpox was being eradicated, new diseases were spreading such as river blindness, Orteg bilharzia, caused by a worm which likes to live in rivers. It infects the urinary tract or intestines, but because Africans were poor, they couldn't afford the doctors, clinics, and medicine they needed to fight those diseases. And so a combination of trade barriers, inefficient governments, a lack of education, harsh environments, and disease meant that this system was doomed to fail from the beginning. There was simply no way for any African nation to reach wealth and prosperity at that time, because of the underdeveloped countries they inherited from their former colonizers. But this raises a new question. Why did African countries choose this system in the first place? Well, the reason is that this was a system which they inherited from their former colonizers, where the colonial government controlled nearly every aspect of the colony's economy. And if they wanted to switch to a free market system like Western Europe, East Asia, or North America, then they would need business people and entrepreneurs to set up new businesses. But the problem with this is that Africans weren't allowed to run businesses under colonialism, so the entrepreneurial attitude didn't exist on top of that. Due to colonialism, Africans were never trained in modern skills. So if you wanted to open a factory, for example, it would be impossible to find qualified employees who knew how to run the machines and factories in today's world. And so Africa's leaders thought that African socialism was the best way to create wealth and prosperity.
Voice from Africa.
Our struggle,
Tom Maboya of Kenya.
Struggle, a human struggle. The struggle in Africa is one for nothing less and nothing more than the eradication of poverty, disease, and ignorance.
But this only explains why Africa didn't become wealthy right after independence. However, after a few decades, Africans would have better education and would be able to indeed set up African businesses using African labor to create African industry. Yet this didn't happen until the 21st century. So why didn't this happen earlier? Well, this has a lot to do with the corruption that emerged after independence. Shortly before independence, most African colonies became democratic, and these democracies were very unstable because they had only been around for a few years. In most cases, we still see this today, where recent democracies tend to be the least stable democracies, and most African nations were not at all united. Some countries were lucky in that most people spoke the same language, while other countries had hundreds of different languages. So instead, politicians realized that they could more easily win votes if they targeted specific ethnic groups. As a result, politics was divided along ethnic lines, and African countries became more and more divided with each election in the 1960s and 70s. So now groups of people were not only divided based on ethnicity, but also separated politically based on where they were born from the perspective of a politician. This made perfect sense. If you want to win votes, appeal to certain ethnic groups, but from the perspective of the country as a whole, it made the country more difficult to govern over time. And if a candidate decided to appeal to the whole country instead of specific ethnic groups, then they would lose elections. And so through a natural process, African nations tended to become more divided after independence, all thanks to the social and political systems left behind by their former colonizers. A prominent example of what has went horribly wrong was Rwanda, with the Rwandan genocide, where over 500,000 members of the Tutsi ethnic group were massacred, along with many other crimes against humanity. Once a party got into power, they would try to keep the power for themselves. Many Africans saw democracy as nothing more than a mess of infighting with opposition parties, abusing their power to hinder the greater national interest. Therefore, a single-party system was created in many African nations in the years following independence by crushing the opposition, and in countries with hundreds of different cultures and languages, it makes sense that you wouldn't want to deal with all of them vying for power. By the 1980s, the elites had taken full control over the political system in most African countries, and so very little changed after independence, with European elites replaced with African elites, and those new elites were concerned that they would be overthrown in a coup. So how are they going to keep themselves in power? Well, by taking the money intended for economic development and handing them out as salaries to powerful government officials to keep them happy enough that they wouldn't start a rebellion. But whereas colonies had oversight from their European government, who would fire anyone getting too corrupt, the new leaders had no such oversight, and if outsiders wanted access to African resources, all they had to do was bribe government officials to get access. And so African governments and companies started paying money to the African elites to gain access to the resources rich nations needed to run their own economies. As a result, the elites became richer, while the poor became even poorer. So if you're an oil company, all you have to do is bribe government officials, and you can extract all the oil that you want. The elites would get a portion of the profits, while the people would see no benefits from resources taken from their own country. This is a system which is still active in many parts of Africa to this day. There will always be somebody else who is willing to pay. As a result, anyone who thinks morality is more important than those resources will always be by the ones who are willing to pay the bribe. Thus, you create a system where world leaders who are willing to pay those bribes will always have an advantage over those who won't pay bribes, and over time, bribes had become the norm in Africa. Despite being aware of the situation, African countries in the 1960s lacked the military power to properly counteract the exploitation they were facing. As a result, they had to seek help from their former colonizers for assistance in restoring order and peace. The French and British, in particular, suppressed rebellions and protests across Africa in exchange for greater access to African resources. For example, in 1962, French troops broke up fighting in what is now called the Republic of Congo and put down a rebellion in Cameroon. Meanwhile, the British suppressed mutinies in Kenya and Tanzania. By 1965, these military interventions became common across Africa, from Algeria to Congo, Benin, the Central African Republic, Upper Volta, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia. All independent countries, and all had European troops stationed there to secure European access to African resources. African nations experienced around 40 successful coups within the first 2 decades after independence, and so Africa gained a reputation for being a very unstable country, so unstable in fact that almost nobody wanted to invest in Africa anymore, except for their resources. And this highlights another issue: people think of Africa as a single entity, a continent filled with poverty and war. So when someone hears about, for example, Boko Haram in Nigeria, it is often grouped with the rest of Africa as just being another war in a continent filled with war. Yet what most people don't realize is that the area in which they operate is over 1,000 kilometers away from Nigeria's economic centers and has almost no effect on business. They are further away than Amsterdam is from Warsaw, but companies will still refuse to do business in Africa because of this belief. And this creates a cycle. People group Africa together as a poor continent, resulting in less business, which results in Africa staying in poverty. The third was the fall of the Soviet Union. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union decided to stop participating in the Cold War and focus on its own economy. As a result, it was no longer sending as much money to African allies. In turn, Western countries decided that they were also going to send less money to Africa. So all of a sudden, African leaders no longer had enough money to keep themselves in power with the system of bribes. And so African leaders decided to ask Western nations for financial aid. But this time, those Western nations were no longer interested in giving money directly. Instead, African nations would have to sign loans with rich countries. And in exchange, African countries would have to reform their economies in such a way that it would become easier for companies to do business in those countries. And while various industries were privatized and free markets emerged, most African countries underwent few reforms. And the reason they underwent so few reforms is that African dictators had an idea they could pretend to privatize their economy by selling the privatization to the highest bidder. Basically doing what they had been doing for the past couple of decades, bribes in exchange for access to African markets. So in effect, nothing changed except that this time Western institutions supported this process by rewarding those dictators through foreign aid packages, making bribes even more profitable in Nigeria. For example, the government privatized various state-owned businesses, of which 80% of the shares were owned by the leaders of the country. In effect, not changing anything at all. In Kenya, Uganda, Zaire, Guinea, and Senegal, they sold government businesses to the friends and family of government leaders. The only businesses which actually saw significant investments were oil and mineral extraction, which, just like in the 60s and 70s, had been sold off to the highest bidder by bribing government officials.
It's their turn to eat.